These two volumes, Si-Chehreh, are very different than anything I have done in my life. I've done a little more than maybe 30 books. I've translated or written, and nothing like this I've done. They've all been works of scholarship, works of biography, works of scholarly biographies. There have been some translation. I've translated a novel, novella from Farsi to English, Golshiri work. But this one is very different. This one, both of them are written in a very short time. The volume 1 was literally written in 3 months, and volume 2 was almost written in the same period of time, but with some distance. I wanted to make sure that there will be a second volume. There was. The first volume was well received, so I wrote the second volume. In literary criticism, when they talk about the genres of writing, there is a genre they talk about as faction. Faction is a combination of fact and fiction. Many people say that the first maybe modern novel written in the tradition of faction was written in cold blood, Truman Capote. This is a work of faction, if there is any word for it. These are not scholarly accounts. These are brief sketches of people I have known, 60 people I have known, and there might be a third volume if I survive, of some of the other people that I truly want to write about. And they are the people who are my family, people who are my friends, people who are colleagues, people who have been guests at Stanford University, and I have met them and come to know them. I've done brief biographical sketches. I've published a 2-volume book called Eminent Persians, but that is a very different thing. I didn't choose the people to write about. That was chosen by a committee of very prominent people in different fields. And the subject was getting to write about people who have done something very new in Iran. This one has no such claim. These are the people I know. These are the people I wanted to write about. But I think compositely, they provide an image of why the revolution happened. That's why it's called Simorgh. The Farsi was called Si-Chehreh. I initially wanted to maybe call it Si-Sima, but I thought that was a little bit loose. So I decided to call it Si-Chehreh, but that was essentially what that was intended to conjure. 30 people who go looking for Simorgh, for the ultimate mythical bird, and at the end they realize there is no mythical bird, they are the story. And for me, the story of the revolution is what we all did, each of us. What we did, what we didn't do. The choices we made, the little choices we made, the little choices we didn't make. So it's from that composite image that I think we get a sense of why what happened to us has happened. And I think the first step in making sure that that thing that happened to us, that calamity that happened to us, does not happen again, is understanding why it happened the first time. Enough of trying to find one guilty person and blaming it all on them, whether it's the Shah, whether it's the leftists, whether it's the Mujahid, whether it's the British, whether it's the Jimmy Carter. They all have played their role, but so have each of us. Without us, they would be nothing. But that was my inadvertent purpose. And when I wrote it, and because I wrote it so very quickly, as I said, I wasn't sure I was going to write the second volume. And when I wrote the second volume, I thought I was fairly finished with it till we invited her for a talk to Stanford. And as a parting gift, I gave her a copy of this too. I had no plans for the translation of the book, none, zero. She left, and 2 days later she called and said, I'm at the airport, I'm reading your book. This is really a very good book. Why didn't you translate it? I said, well, I've never thought about translating. She got on the plane, she went to Los Angeles. From Los Angeles, she wrote back and said, you know, would you be amenable to me translating? I said, what are you talking about? She is a remarkable translator. I've translated. Translation is a very thankless job. George Steiner, one of my favorite literary critics, says the biggest mystery in literature, more than literature itself, is translation. And George Steiner knows translation and knows literature. I had read her remarkable translation of a book about Arbi Avanesian, and I had the great pleasure of reading her translation of the Lament. So for me, and I think for anyone who has ever written anything in Farsi, it is a dream come true to have someone of her erudition, her scholarship, her detail, attention to detail, her discipline to work, and her impeccable understanding of nuance. I can tell you that when I read her translation, I thought I was having the same images in my mind, the same sounds in my mind that came to my mind when I wrote it in Farsi. That's the most difficult thing to translate. To not just get the literal stuff across. The dictionary can do that. ChatGPT can do that. But ChatGPT can never get that la, the tone. And she gets the tone remarkably. And she does it because she's extremely disciplined, extremely erudite, and extremely kind. So, Professor Afshar.
Well, I was going to start by saying, first of all, thank you very much. You, Broma, Franco, everybody for having me here. It's just a real pleasure being back. I had such a great time last year, and I'm having a ball right now, and thank you all for coming. I was going to say something that you already said, so I don't really have much to say. I was going to say, well, actually, let me say it, that there is a line that repeats across the book in many of the portraits that says, I first saw so-and-so, or I first heard of so-and-so, or the first time I saw him weep, or the first time I heard him talk. And I was going to say that boomeranging this, I should say, the first time I saw these books was when I was leaving Stanford last year, and Dr. Milani gave me this parting gift, which I couldn't part with. I started reading, and as he said, I wrote him and I said, anyone translating? And he said, anyone. I said, well, I am anyone, if you want. And that's how it all started. And it was really, I don't know about thanklessness. On one level, I suppose it is. But on another, I just find it incredibly exciting, internally, externally, to translate a book like this, because you learn so much. I mean, the way Dr. Milani describes a scene, as you're translating, you're thinking, would I describe the scene this way or not? And then why, and why not? It's a very, strangely enough, introspective process. At least it was for me. And then, of course, I began by reading a couple of the portraits of the people that I knew personally. And by the time I got to the airport, and I got there early because I wanted to read the book, more of the book, I started at the beginning. And I would recommend any of you who get the book to start at the beginning with the story of Zizi John. his mother, this lady. And so I couldn't put it down. I learned so much in translating any single portrait. I wanted to know more about the person, about the events that he's describing, it was just like exploring, like an archaeological dig into history, into events that I had heard about but didn't know enough about. The words, the Persian language, the words that he uses a lot of words that I had to look up. And that is not a very kind of, should I say, remunerative activity. We do not really have a very good Persian English dictionary accessible online. It is painful trying to look up something in De Khuda sometimes. I love the man, no doubt. But anyway, I learned a lot of new Persian vocabulary. I learned a lot about history. And so here we are. I would love to read some of the stories to you, excerpts. And I would love if Dr. Milani introduced some of them, maybe starting with Zizi John, your mother, and then I'll read a passage.
Okay. My mother is one of those, I think, remarkable characters that we find in almost every Iranian family. A lion of a woman who lives in a society that doesn't like lionesses, who wants a woman to be docile, who wants a woman to follow the established order. She was every bit, in my view, as intelligent as her brothers. Certainly more intelligent than a couple of her brothers. And some of her brothers were ministers, very prominent intellectuals in modern Iranian history. My mother was every bit as intelligent. She had only 5-6 classes at home, never got educated. And in one sense, it was a wasted woman of her time. It was a woman who could be someone else. It was a woman who finally was happy to be a wife and a good mother. But I think she could have been a lot more than she was. And it was the constraints of society. That's why I began it with her. It's not just because we all come from our mothers, but she is truly, I think, a remarkable, she was a remarkable woman. Brave, harsh. I say if she lived in England, she might have been Margaret Thatcher. I didn't choose that rather lightly. That was intended to be a clear indication of how tough she could be, as well as how wonderful she was.
Here's a list of what I thought we might read. Everything could be had in the free or the black and gray market, including Homa. Prior to this, he explains that he smoked a cigarette that's called Homa. One day I went to my mother's house. She asked, "Abbas, dear, did you pick up my cigarettes?" I apologized, I forgot. She reacted somewhat apprehensively. I've run out of cigarettes. I forgot to tell you yesterday. I said, "I'll pick up a pack from the grocer around the corner." I knew from experience that Haj Agha ba Taqwa, the name means the pious Haji. I knew from experience that Haj Agha ba Taqwa also dealt in the black and gray market. Thanks to his corruption, I usually managed to acquire some scarce goods for my parents. When I reached the grocery store, the owner was busy. Waiting until the coast was clear, I greeted him and said, "I forgot to pick up cigarettes for my mother. She smokes Homa, you know. If you could let me have a pack now, I'll pay you back tomorrow." He pouted, placed the pack on the counter and said, "Here, but tell Mrs. Shadman there's been a revolution. It's not like old times when she could always issue sundry commands." The tenor of his words caught me off guard. I didn't know what commands my mother might have issued in the past. I said nothing except thanks, but I returned the same unopened packet to him the following day. When I came home, I handed the pack to my mother. She praised Haji for his sense of gratitude, saying he was not like those others. I did not know that my next words were to turn my mother's life upside down. I related what Haji had said. Although the stroke had bent my mother's face a little out of shape, and it was difficult to read her expressions, she grew visibly upset. Enraged and defiant, she said, "Return the pack to him tomorrow." Then, as if wishing to round off her declaration with a simple finale, declared, "I will not smoke anymore," and added, "We had yet to be shat on by an asshole crow." She quit a 40-year habit on the spot and never smoked again. That's the mother.
میخوایم پاراگرافش میکنم. I'll just read one paragraph. به خانه که رسیدم سیگار را به مادرم دادم. به حاجی دعا کرد که قدرشناس است و مانند اینها نیست. نمیدانستم چند کلمه بعدم زندگی مادرم را دگرگون میکند. گفته های حاجی را باز گفتم. مادرم به رغم اینکه سکته کمی چهرهش را کج کرده بود و شناخت حالاتش را دشوار می‌نمود، آشکارا برآشفت. پرسید چی گفت؟ گفته حاجی را باز گفتم. با چهره‌ای پر از خشم و سرکشی گفت بسته را فردا پس بده. سپس انگار بخواهد پایانی ساده به گفتارش بیفزاید گفت من دیگه سیگار نمی‌کشم. هرگز هم دیگر سیگار نکشید. اعتیادی 40 ساله را در جا ترک کرد. و اعتیاد, for those of you who are Iranian, اعتیاد is not just any اعتیاد, it's اعتیاد هما, the most potent cigar.
Absolutely. So I want to read a passage about his father, Mahasti Milani. Even as a child, I found my father's attitude toward mullahs to be extremely interesting and a rarity. Whenever his eyes fell on a mullah, he'd say, "See that thick neck, Abbas John?" and add, giggling, "You should wet your hand and hit him right in the neck." After the revolution, I saw the euphoria of mischief in his eyes the day I took him to an office building for some business. I drove the car over the sidewalk up close to the entrance. My father had just been discharged from the hospital. A car had hit him on a rainy night and knocked him into the gutter. His legs were in the cast for several months, and for some time afterwards, he had to walk on crutches. Passers-by marked his distressed state, and nobody fussed when I pulled onto the sidewalk. But while I stood there waiting for him, I got an earful of expletives aimed at my mother and sister. Not that they were around. When my father exited the building, hobbling on his crutches, he had a triumphant smile on his face. "I finally rode a mullah piggyback," he said. "I was having a tough time getting down the stairs with these crutches. A mullah walked up to me and said, 'That is such a burden, Father.' He spoke loudly so everybody could hear. I replied in an even louder voice, 'Perchance a merciful holy man like you might lighten it.' He had no other option. I came down the stairs on his back." would you like to introduce, how about Mahdi Khan? Should I just read on the start, or would you like to talk about him a little bit?
Go ahead and read. I can. Mahdi Khan Baba Tehrani is the next one that she's going to read from. Mahdi Khan Baba Tehrani was one of the sort of iconic characters of the Iranian Confederation. Almost everybody hated him. Almost everybody loved him. And he was active for many years. And there are millions of stories about Khan Baba. I should say that several of the people who are in the book are now in this room. I won't tell you who they are, but they are in this room. So look around, they might be sitting next to you. Khan Baba is not here, however.
I had heard about him before we met. The Congress of the Confederation of Iranian Students had just ended. A friend, more precisely a comrade, had just returned from the meeting. For us enthusiasts, her standing was like that of a Haji fresh back from Mecca. Short of offering her a sacrificial lamb, we hung on to her every word and observation with the same fervor as religious zealots. A battle royale had broken out at the Confederation among the revolutionists, liquidationists, revisionists, and representatives of the national bourgeoisie. Naturally, given that, as Saadi says, everyone presumes their own intellect to be supreme, each believed they were revolutionary and righteous, and the others heretical and deviant. According to the comrade, Mahdi Khan Baba was leaning against the wall and taking a puff non-stop with his long cigarette holder. She enunciated long cigarette holder as if it epitomized the moral depravities and delinquencies of the bourgeoisie, and went on to say, a group of his greenhorns were coiled around him. Knowing the heretics' acolytes were greenhorns, what our followers were revolutionary youth, I asked, which tribe does this Mahdi hail from? Khan Baba is one of the leaders of the liquidationists, she replied, in a tone that packed an earful, meaning, what a jerk. You call yourself a revolutionary and you don't even know the name of the enemy of the people? Later on, when I learned a little more about Mahdi's life, I realized that in fact, that same long cigarette holder was a token of his immunity to the revolutionaries' mostly duplicitous protocols and procedures. He considered his private life private and did not brand the appetite for worldly pleasures immoral. Oddly enough, both Mahdi's revolutionary rivals, as well as Sabak and the cultural commissars of the Islamic regime, wielded certain aspects of his private life as weapons against him. And still do, referring disparagingly to his long cigarette holder or his visit to a nudist lakefront.
پیش از آن که ببینمش ذکرش را شنیده بودم. کنگره کنفدراسیون تازه تمام شده بود. یکی از دوستان، دقیق‌تر یکی از رفقا، تازه از کنگره برگشته بود. برای ما مشتاقان جایگاهش مثل یک حاجی تازه از مکه برگشته بود. گرچه گوسفندی پیش پایش قربانی نکردیم، ولی با همون ولع هر مؤمن به هر واژه و هر کلامش می‌آویختیم. جنگ بین انقلابیون و انحلال طلبان و تجدید نظر طلبان و نمایندگان برجوازی ملی مغلوبه شده بود. Several of those representatives are in this room, incidentally. Representatives of all these sects. طبیعتاً همونطوری که به قول سعدی همه کس عقل خود را به کمال نماید، ما هم هر کدام خود را انقلابی و مؤمن و دیگران را رافضی و منحرف می‌دانستیم. رفیق میگفت در گوشه از سالن انتظار کنگره مهدی خانبابا به دیواری تکیه زده بود. دائم به چوب سیگار بلندش پک میزد. چوب سیگار بلند را طوری گفت که انگار تجسم تمام انحرافات اخلاقی و اجحافات بورژوازی بود. But the paragraph ends with this. One of the reasons people didn't approve of him, almost everybody had something to criticize about him, is that مهدی او زندگی خصوصیش را خصوصی می‌دانست. سودای لذایذ این جهانی را گناه نمی‌دانست. شگفت این که هم رقبای انقلابی مهدی، هم ساواک، هم هویت سازان رژیم جمهوری اسلامی جنبه‌هایی از زندگی خصوصی او را به حربه علیهش بدل کردند و می‌کنند. یکی از چوب سیگار بلندش می‌گفت و آن دیگری از رفتنش به ساحل لختی‌ها.
Shall I? I love this character, Paved Kalantari. He was an artist. We'll talk about his art a little bit more later. The first time I saw him weep, or more precisely, the first time we wept together, we had traveled to his parents' home in Taliban with our families. It was nighttime and the sky was starlit, the silence of the village broken only by a dog's intermittent barking. Muhammad, the husband of Parviz's sister Shahla and a gifted architect, was grilling lamb fries with our mutual friend, Attar. Vodka, tomatoes, and cucumbers were laid out on a table by the grill. Parviz's parents and the other guests were waiting inside their Spartan rustic house. Taliban was very different then from what I hear about it from friends today. While chatting and swilling and taking a bite of the fries, at first for me, as I had never tasted them before, Parviz relived memories of his political activities as a youth. He had become a member of the Tudeh party, like his father, who was still a Tudeh at 70 and seemed never to have risen to his feet from the opium brazier since 1953 and the party's defeat. It is as if Ahavan Solis had penned Winter, in which he portrays a man frozen stiff in the face of that defeat, with Arjun in mind. Arjun was an extremely amiable soul. To him, Ehsan Tabari, theoretician of the Tudeh party, was still the epitome of intellectuality. One day I was having a discussion in the same house with a friend who claimed the mantle of a darwish and who had opened the first hamburger joint in the style of McDonald's called Mac Ali. He was defending his mystical ways and I was stuffing dialectical materialism down his throat. After a while, Arjun turned to me and muttered under his breath, "Leave him alone, man. Even Comrade Tabari himself couldn't bring him around." There is a passage, I don't know where you describe the painting.
Oh.
It would be nice to read that now, I think.
Yeah.
It's under Marufi, Abbas Milani.
Yes, it's Abbas Milani. Yes. Yes. Let me give a context, then you read that. When I was leaving Iran in 1986, Parviz Kalantari took me to the airport. At that time, you had to go to the airport at 2 in the morning. And he came and picked me up, and we wept on the road. It was raining. And I got on the plane. A few months later, he sent me a painting that he had done that day. The painting was later put on the cover of a magazine. Abbas Milani had a magazine at the time, and the mullahs and their hoodlums thought of the painting as an assault on Islam and as an assault on the regime. They attacked the office of Abbas Milani. They arrested poor Milani. They closed the paper down, and they summoned Parviz to the Revolutionary Court. Fortunately, he was in Los Angeles at the time. And then he sent the painting, he gave the painting to a friend who was leaving Iran illegally. He had folded it 8 times and put it in an envelope, folded envelope, padded envelope, and horseback several weeks. And by the time I got it, it had all the markings, foldings. It still has, it's a remarkable painting, and she will read it.
When it's a little bit the same that you just heard, so stop me if you want me to sort of jump ahead. Anyone, just raise your hands and I'll stop. When leaving Iran on a melancholic, rainy night, my friend Parviz Kalantari drove me to the airport. He came to fetch me at 2 o'clock in the morning. A few months later, he graciously sent me the piece that he had painted after my departure. The canvas is composed of 2 distinct parts, separated from one another with a wave-like line. In the lower register, a woman lies on her back, clad in what looks like a chador. Her cheeks are flushed. A young boy sits by her mother's side looking anguished. Attractive houses and other structures, voluminous and undulating, are embedded in that black chador and stand out conspicuous and inviting. The pitch dark night notwithstanding. Many of them feature ventilation shafts that recall the architecture of towns bordering the Iranian desert. The aura and ambiance of the structures intimate Kalantari's famed earthen canvases. As in that collection, a mosque appears in their midst. The crescent moon, slender but eye-catching, lies in a corner of the sky. Every building and even the moon is painted in a cobalt blue chiaroscuro, a faint shadow perhaps of the dark night oppressing the houses envelopes that particular impression of Iran in a shroud of sorrow. The intensity in the sun's eyes might also suggest an enduring spirit and a glimmer of hope in spite of the harrowing bleakness that blankets Iran and Iranians. In the upper register of the painting, which takes up the largest portion of the canvas, a colorful airplane, not unlike a child's toy or drawing, is headed toward a seemingly splendorous west. This section is in the style of Kalantari's childlike collection. A man in a suit and tie, bespectacled and luggage in hand, that's me, is dangling from the airplane and flying towards some glittering skyscrapers. That's a character in the corner. I wanted to say just one thing, that in the process of translation, I suggested to Dr. Milani, the copy editor at some point suggested, I think our wonderful publisher, Mr. Abbas Milani, suggested that we supplement a few elements to the book. First names that are missing, because obviously the intention of the book is for people who know it to, or the book is intended for people who would recognize these people. No first name needed. But in translating, we thought maybe a few dates here and there just to anchor the story in a place. Because I thought for myself it would help if I knew what period we were talking about. So we added a few things, and here and there we, it would be helpful to explain the the profession or the reputation or something about somebody. Few words here and there. And Dr. Milani graciously accepted, because somebody might say, don't you dare touch my book. But he said, fine. And we did that. It's interesting that when going through the book, trying to pick some passages that I thought you might find interesting to be read, I wanted to point out where we had added any few words, and I couldn't tell. I couldn't remember, I couldn't tell, because it all blends in well. So, but just so you know, that the process involved my writing, translating 4 or 5 portraits, sending them to Dr. Milani, who would write back, comment, slash, burn, modify, and then most of the time we agreed 100% on everything. There were a couple of occasions where neither of us was very happy with, translations of aphorisms from Persian, 12th century Persian poetry. Sometimes it's really just not possible to sort of capture that exactly. So it was a very interesting process, a very interesting back and forth. But I have to say, I cannot imagine working with an author being as easy, as rewarding, and as gratifying as working with Dr. Milani. Because you just, there's never a wall. It's open to all questions, to all suggestions, and to modifications. So I had to say that in your face, I'm sorry. But I wanted to put it.
Well, I have to make one small correction here. Never slash and burn. I would never dare do that. And you would never allow it, of course. But I want you to pay attention to one. I want to see how she works. Okay? Look at that book. Look at all the markings she has. Okay? And this is what she's put in front of me. This is every passage she's going to read from where she begins to where she ends, what page it is. It is impeccable how much preparation she puts into everything she does. It is remarkable. 99.9% of intellectuals I know, particularly amongst our compatriots, when they're doing a book reading, they think they've written the damn book, they come and read it. And they think you should be happy to be here. She has prepared for this session as much as she would have worked if she was giving a scholarly paper. That's how she works.
You said it to my face then.
Never behind your face.
There is a story about 2 characters. Fardin Modarresi. I thought it was a man when I first read the name. Fardin Modarresi and Niyaz Yaqub Shahi. That is to die for. I think you should maybe just introduce them briefly and then I'll read the passage.
Fardin Modarresi was one of the most remarkable Iranian women I have known. She was an accountant by profession, but a communist by avocation, a Tudeh, member of a Tudeh party, with whom I profoundly disagreed. I thought the Tudeh party was the wretched of the earth, and she thought I, as a Maoist, was the wretched of the earth, but we got along famously well. She was the beloved of one of he is still alive. Fardin was killed in the Islamic Republic. She was one of the few leaders of the Tudeh party who stood by her position and was literally tortured to death. And her daughter is in the US. And I was doing a reading, I was doing once a talk, and this lady comes and says, my father sent his And the father was a poet, he was a leftist, but not as dedicated as Fardin. And their love story is one of the most remarkable love stories, and some of the scenes that I had heard them describe to me. I've used images from James Joyce's The Dead, the Dubliners. To me, their story is every bit as beautiful. If you've seen the film The Dead, and if you've seen the last 5 minutes, 10 minutes of The Dead, where he quotes from the James Joyce story, 30 years before I read those lines, I heard them in his life.
One night when it was snowing heavily, Niaz, that's the boyfriend, Niaz, who lived in the working class district in southern Tehran, was pining for his beloved. As he later recounted, I yearned to see Fardin with all my body and soul. He somehow managed to get himself to Shemiran in the north and climbed over the wall. Then with much difficulty and quietly, so as not to awaken Agha and Khanum, that's the parents who've been introduced before, he hauled himself onto the second floor balcony by Fardin's window. Niaz tapped on the glass softly. With a sweet smile that never left her lips, Fardin recalled, I woke up rattled. I turned on the light. I could see Niaz standing in the falling snow. I wanted to laugh and felt delirious and scared all at the same time. Should Agha and Khanum come in and see Niaz on the balcony, they would have a heart attack. I never asked how that night ended or how long Niaz stayed. All I know is that Agha and Khanum never found out about his visit. They prohibited Fardin from marrying Niaz, and she, despite all the respect she felt for her parents, refused to acquiesce. Fardin was a maven of finer things and recognized the value of Niaz's pure and guileless love, nor would she cave in to pressure. Later, what you were saying, after seeing The Dead, John Huston's brilliant adaptation of that, the last story in James Joyce's Dubliners, I thought of the final scene as a tragic variant of Niaz and Fardin's tryst in the snow and their unrequited love. In Joyce's story, on hearing that his beloved will be leaving the city the next day, the 17-year-old Michael Fury sneaks out into the icy Irish snow and, standing outside her window while sick with consumption and the cold, sings a love song until dawn to say goodbye, and not long after her departure, dies. In the story, it was the force of nature and the beloved's departure, along with Michael's illness, that forged the fate of a love unrequited. And in the case of Fardin and Niaz, political dictatorship. That's it. Do you want more of that?
No. You're the boss.
I want to read the funny one about with Iskandar Shahrukhi.
Oh. Stalin and Iskandar Shahrukhi? No, I know where it is. Yeah. Iskandar Shahrukhi was a very dear friend of mine. He worked at Qanun Parvarish Fikri Kudakan. He was a relative of the Shah, and thus he never worked at the Qanun, and nobody dared say anything to him. He was one of the most erudite people I've ever known, and a great sense of humor. And he knew a lot of the intellectuals at the time. He worked with my then wife. I think in a sense he was in love with my then wife. I describe all of this, it's in there. And they had a very interesting relationship, and he had a wonderful relationship with my son. And Freud would have had a wonderful time imagining all the things that goes on in his mind as he read stories to my son. And he was also an addict, an opium addict. And he would tell me stories about, I think that's what you're going to read, about, I once asked him, I said, what is this? Why are you so interested in this damn thing? He said, well, you don't know. You don't know what goes on when people sit around and smoke. And then he told me this story.
When I felt close enough to Iskandar to ask him why he had turned to opium, I had heard him say opium is a cure for every pain except the pain of addiction. He quipped, Abbas, dear, you have no idea what an inimitable circle the vicarious fellowship of the brazier constitutes. It's manifest paradise. Everyone is free to speak and fabricate whatever tales they want, and no one has the energy or the urge to question even the most ludicrous claims. He went on. One day we were unwinding around the opium brazier with a bunch of former Tudais in Babol. I knew that during World War II, that city had been a center of Tudeh party operations under the protection of Big Brother, which had occupied Mazandaran, and it was now home to a coterie of opium buffs who had educated and groomed as Tudais, had been educated and groomed as Tudais. Iskandar had bonded with that group. In describing their gatherings, he continued, one fellow declaimed, his cheeks flushed, when Comrade Stalin was on his way to the Tehran conference. Once they got to the Kandavan tunnel, they realized a rock slide was blocking the comrade's vehicle from passing through. He was in a particular hurry because, per his Bolshevik discipline, he certainly did not want to be late. I was the expedition pathfinder. I loaded Comrade Stalin on my back and, trekking a trail I knew, transported him from one side of the mountain to the other side. The snow was up to my knees, but the excitement of carrying Comrade Stalin on my back would let me dread neither snow nor rain. Iskandar added, chuckling, in that educated and jail-hardened circle, not a single soul questioned any detail of that totally mythical, though rather meaningful, story, except when he finished talking, another former Tudei held out the opium pipe and said, Comrade, have another pod to relieve your fatigue. And the Stalinist comrade replied, not now. I also learned from Iskandar that opium smokers never say, I don't want any, or I've had enough. They only say, not now.
Iskandar had a very tragic end. The IRGC picked him up, and this was early in the, after the revolution, and they would take these people and take them to virtually a concentration camp and zero tolerance, and some of them died. He was one of the people who died. So there is tragedy as well as there is comedy.
Arsalan. Arsalan.
Oh, yeah.
Aslan.
Aslan, again, was a remarkable person I met in prison. Some of you might know I was in prison under the Shah for about 12 months. 6 months of it was in Evin. And in that 6 months, I was in a special wing. It was called Banda Aghayun, which was special for the top clergy who were in prison. Almost the entire leadership of the future Islamic Republic were my cellmates for 6 months. And some of the Iranian intellectuals. Mohsen Yalfani, for example, Said Sultanpur, for example. One of them was Aslan, who had been arrested with these theater people, but he was a truck driver. He had a group of friends it was really wonderful. He was a very nice guy, but he was a very dedicated truck driver. And he had gone to see his friend, and Savak had come there and taken over the place and said, this is a guerrilla place of hiding, and arrested everybody, including him. And he took 3 years in prison. For 3 years. And when I asked him, I said, well, you didn't do anything. Why didn't you get out? He said, well, it wasn't manly of me to leave my friends. 3 years to show his manliness.
One day we were resting in the pleasant shade of a wall in the mullah's block, waiting for our turn to play volleyball. The mullahs and leftist intellectuals used to take their meals separately. The mullahs considered us unclean, of course, and even in those days acted as a class apart from us non-Muslims, except when it came to volleyball, although that too was apparently taboo for some. Aslan suddenly said, you must have noticed that I'm the only one who has a spoonful of honey in the mornings. I hadn't noticed. Though canvassing and parsing and discussing the slightest feature of every prisoner's carriage, including what they chewed at the common communal meal, was one of the leftists' regular pastimes or maladies. I did not indulge in such talk. In the standard vocabulary of the day, such probing and enjoining virtue was exercised under the banner of ideological struggles and constructive criticism. In any event, I had never noticed Aslan's spoonful of honey. I have a nocturnal spermatoria problem, he said. And Doc has prescribed honey. I was sure I'd misheard him, and so I asked, what problem? Thinking I didn't know what nocturnal spermatoria meant, he elaborated in plainer terms. I thought if Federico Fellini ever filmed such a dialogue, viewers would believe it was fantasy. Not knowing what I should do or say, I responded awkwardly, oh wow, I didn't know honey had such properties. It was perhaps the stupidest possible reaction, more out of desperation than reflection. I never found out nor asked how he managed to confront the very stiff prison doctor with his wet dreams earnestly enough to get him to prescribe him honey. It was easier to digest why the comrades had not censored him. Aslan was an actual worker, and no doubt a proletarian nocturnal problem was more digestible than petit bourgeois belly aches.
We discussed a great deal about what to call ihtilam. And eventually we came, I don't know whether you all know what ihtilam means. Those of you who are Persian speakers, ihtilam means a wet dream. But it's in Arabic. It's also a theological term. So we decided we call it a wet dream, but they said, no, ihtilam is a little more complicated. So she came up with this more complicated term.
Should I just read about him, or would you like to talk about him?
Oh, yeah.
I can start and then you read some, maybe.
Yeah, we should say a few words about Iraj Pezeshzad. Let me say, okay. Iraj Pezeshzad, we give an award every year called the Beta Award. We've given 15, and the next one, I think you might not know, some of you might not know, is Hossein Amanat, the architect who built the Shah-Yad monument. And Pezeshzad was one of the past winners. And some of truly the most remarkable Iranian artists, writers, architects, critics have been past recipients, including our own Professor Beyzai, and Pezeshzad was one of them. I should say that Vita Daryabari, who has endowed the program, is also here, although she hasn't won the Beta Award. She gives it, she hasn't won it.
Iraj Pezeshkzad spent a lifetime hounded by the fame of his iconic book, Daijan Napoleon, and his aristocratic lineage. He was hounded by the proponents of what the Islamists called valued art, and other revolutionaries committed art. It matters little whether value and commitment are deemed to be earthly and historical or heavenly and supernal, and whether, as happened in post-revolution Iran, they coalesce into a single dogma that treats literature as a tool of ideology. For advocates of value or commitment in art, humor and joy were the nemesis of piety and revolution. Pezeshkzad was further hounded by those that decreed fame to be a banality and the sign of collusion with gold and grudge and guile. Zaro zuru zivar, zaro zuru tazvir, as Ali Shariati put it, except, of course, in the case of men of fame who issued such fatwas. I didn't read that well, but I think you get it. Pezeshkzad was hounded by those who held that suits and ties and government jobs, even in the case of an ethical and competent diplomat, do not square with intellectualism. He was hounded by critics who considered satire plebeian and felt it had no place in the Republic of Literature, revolutionary or modernist. Finally, he was hounded by those who had lampooned in his Asmun Rismun, Heavenly Yarn, as a worthless and cheeky bunch some 20 years earlier. Later on, he wrote a new and more political parody of the same chicks in his Internationale pour Ruha, Bache pour Ruha, the International of the Cheeky Bunch. The hounders were legion, but the scope of Pezeshkzad's work unmatched their capacity for brouhaha and barbs. I think I have to stop.
Yeah. The remarkable thing about Pezeshkzad is because he was so great of a novelist, he was famous, and he was a bestseller, and he wrote satire, no one took him seriously. Still, he has written one of the most serious novels of 20th century Iran, but because it's satire, and because he was famous, and because the book sold a great deal, and because he wore a tie, there have been virtually not a single serious critique of this book written. 100 reviews of Shamlu and Samad Behrangi, I'm glad about them, but not a single serious book on him. Because he wasn't an intellectual in the mold of the dominant narrative of what intellectuals mean. Maybe we should allow them to ask some questions. You want?
Absolutely.
One
you don't
more?
want to read Parvizi because he's...
Oh, Parvizi, yes.
Do you want, if you want to?
No, whatever you...
Well, I think we should maybe end with somebody who's kind of a home person. Yes? Local.
Yeah, Parvizi.
Yes? This is Dr. Joseph Parvizi.
Oh,
anyone know him?
No, they said read Betas. Somebody says read Betas.
Read Betas? Oh, really? Okay.
I should say, we should read a little bit, but there is actually a logic to how these chapters, I didn't write them in this order, but when we decided to, I decided to make it into a book, I decided there should be a logic to it. There is a logic to volume 1 and a logic to volume 2. Volume 1 begins with my mother, volume 2 begins with my sister, both women who have had profound impact on my life and I think on Iranian society. And then it goes to all the people who have had a very important role to play, and then it ends with in exile, essentially. The people who I think would have been remarkable people if this revolution hadn't happened. So in the first chapter, the first book, it ends with my brother, who was really a remarkable person. The second book ends with Bita, Hamid Muqaddam, who I think are the two faces of the Iranian diaspora that can be absolutely indispensable in saving Iran from this calamity. And the last person with foot is my uncle, because he's my uncle, we have to put him in the last. But because he is also, I think, representative of the kind of a scholar that will save Iran of the future. The scholar who knows the West, who knows Iran, is not awed by either one, and speaks truth. So, please, sorry about that.
My first meeting with Bita Daryabari was about literature. She had just returned from a trip to Iran with her 2 children. She was keen for them to learn about her homeland and speak Persian, and would not cave in to any resistance on their part. A strict and loving mother, both then and now, she puts a lot of effort into their education while allowing them to be free to pursue their own interests. We met at the home of one of her friends 2 or 3 years after the founding of the Iranian Studies program at Stanford. After an exchange of pleasantries that, in Attar's words, served to walk along the talk and pave the way for real dialogue, Bita spoke of a female poet she had met on her trip to Iran, saying she wrote well and that she was blind. She had one of her books of poems with her. Without her actually saying so, I had the impression that she wanted us to invite the blind poet to give a talk at the university. We read some of the verses together. What stood out for me was the poet's blindness rather than the form or the power or novelty of her compositions. I said, I like literature, but I have no expertise in poetry, and added that the lines we had just read were not compelling enough for us to invite her to Stanford, especially given our limited resources. I explained that we were a fledgling program that was limited to offering a few courses, and then mainly in political science and international relations. The rest of the night passed in talking about literature and the dismal conditions in Iran for poets and other writers. Sometime later, Bita invited me to lunch. By then, she and her husband, Omid Kurdistani, had divorced. Despite his fame, Bita had never given up her maiden name, Daryabari. Omid once gave a speech at the university where I heard him describe what an important role she had played in his success. Bita and I met in a Greek restaurant that had recently become popular in town. The table adjacent to ours was set so close that even without intending to, they could easily hear everything we said. Though we spoke Persian and only sometimes broke into English, it felt like the couple next to us were mostly focused on us while fading a casual conversation between themselves. We carried on undeterred. Bita asked about our Iranian studies program and seemed disappointed that we did not offer courses in Persian language or literature. Before lunch was over, she proposed to endow 2 faculty positions to teach both subjects. Her offer took me by surprise. That was not the last time I was to be struck by her largesse on behalf of Iranian culture. A couple of years and conversations later, she increased her endowment to a point where we had the capacity to create a 3rd faculty position and launch a prize in literature. Not long after, we welcomed Bahram Beyzai, who had accepted our invitation to teach at the university. What we decided to call the Bita Prize was, as she had stipulated, to be awarded to artists who had made a significant contribution to Persian language and literature and Iranian culture.
Thank you for your presentation. As I was listening the readings that each of you presented, the question that kept going through my mind was, at the time that Dr. Milani, you wrote the original in Persian, I was thinking who your target audience would be, because it is indeed, as at least the English translation says, portraits on my mind. Clearly, a person interested in the Persian would either have to recognize the names, but more importantly, be interested in you and what those, the interest that they would have in you personally in selecting those names.
Right.
That is, those are specific people that you chose to compile in this, and you start with, with first members of your family. But then, when the decision to do the translation came along, the question that always arises in the translation is who is the target audience for the translation? Because now there is a generational gap that occurs between those that can read the Persian versus those that can't, and then therefore would need to rely on the English. And then the question that I'm facing, and I hope my question is clear and I can get a response to it, who is the target audience for the English? Is it the Iranian diaspora? Is the centrality of the book, again, a reflection of who the author is and their interest in you, in the selection of the names? And then, in the absence of that, how would if somebody is not familiar with those personalities, how will the narrative still have the same effect as the original Persian?
Should I say something?
Yes, please.
I
go
think
ahead.
this question is for you, but to me, the audience is everyone who's been hearing about the Iranian Revolution for the past decades and wondering, how did this come about? Who brought the revolution about? What's the background of the mullahs? What about the political structure? What? So a person who's interested in history and who has been watching television and reading papers and so forth ought to be interested in reading something about a revolution that they have been hearing about for decades. Especially as it says, it portraits different people. It's not one monotone monologue. Of course, I think it's a good question what you raise, the author's identity. I think it is key. And people who recognize Dr. Milani or will look him up will probably be more attracted. They will be more anchored. They'll have a better idea of what to expect. But I remember in somewhere, Sartre once wrote that intellectuals form a social stratum, sort of like of their own, wherever they are. Because there's a realm in which they operate that is similar. Doesn't recognize borders or language or cultures and so forth. And I think that with regards history, it's the same, and historical narratives, it's the same, that there are people who are tuned into history, whether they're Iranians in the diaspora or what. They will read, if this is introduced properly, if it's marketed well to a large enough audience, they will want to know more and will read. That's my impression.
Well, first of all, I think you're confusing two different concepts. One is what literary critics call the model reader of a text. Umberto Eco talks about this. He says every text has a model reader. In other words, the level of discourse, the level of explanation is directed at a certain level of understanding. So if I say in Farsi, Mosaddeq, everybody who I think reads Farsi knows. And that's one of the points we have a great deal of discussion about, where now the model reader of an English text is different, and the kinds of introductions we add, the kind of added. But the other point that you're making is essentially what is the market for this? That's a very different question than what the structure of a text is. The market for it is, depends on the quality of the book. Very simple. There is nothing else that is going to me, the fact that someone like her wanted to translate it was indicative that it has a readership, an interest much larger than what I initially intended it. A very serious publisher has decided to publish it, so they have some consideration of how. And books are sold or successful or fail because of their quality. If it has a quality that carries and gets word of mouth, gets people to say, I read this is interesting, it made me understand, that will sell. If it doesn't, it won't sell. When I wrote it, didn't write it for the market intent. I wrote it because I thought, I needed to write it. And the few people who have read it, who are non-Iranians, have had the kind of a response that she has had, that it gave them a window outside sort of the theoretical or the normal narrative. So,
I just wanted to add one more quickly. Somewhere through, maybe not even halfway through, I think I wrote Dr. Milani, and I said something about how this book has humanized me, that there are characters in there that I hated before. I mean, I knew them personally or knew of them, and yet the look, the approach, the assessment, the presentation of everyone in this book is such that you can't see them in black and white shades. He humanizes people. And I think, to me, that's one of the greatest gifts I have had in translating this. It's changed me, literally. And I think that, these are things that people look for, not just, as you said, theories of, Marxism and today's who are this and who it, but how do you look at an era in history? How do you look at a bunch of people who did this or that made us, end up where we are now? In other words, anybody who has questions about their own lives or the past would be interested. I do think it is important how you reach out, so for students, professors of history, for instance, or literature, to talk about this book and its contents, the audience will grow beyond what we expect.
Yes, you're obviously a great author, and I've enjoyed reading your previous books, and I'm sure this one would be the same. It appears that you're using some anecdotal and personal experience as an example to draw a bigger picture of really what happened in the revolution. And you started your talk by saying that people try to simplify the reasons for the revolution, while there are many, many reasons, and it's much more complex. But on the other hand, aren't we kind of diluting the main reasons for the revolution by putting out so many different examples? Don't the people, at least in the whole region, have the same aspirations or shortcomings, although with different intensities? I saw a little bit of a double standard when, for example, you're using By the way, I have the utmost respect for you, so I'm a little bit hesitant to say this.
No, go ahead. I will respond equally,
Okay.
with equal respect. Don't worry.
For example, use the person who went to jail and said, I'm not going to leave until my comrades leave. And that was with a chuckle, and everybody laughed. But here in the US, when John McCain goes to a jail in Vietnam, and they tell him he could leave because of his father and who he was, he says, no, I'm going to stay my term and live with my other soldier. And then that's an act of bravery. But here, we kind of chuckle on that. And you have been in prison, so you know more than most of us, the experience. And I've seen the same thing in your book, The Shah, which somehow, and I could be wrong, please correct me, that the big elephant is not mentioned. The big elephant, which is common in the whole region. You look at every country in the region, at least in our region, in the West Asia, Middle East, that is now in chaos, turmoil, has had major foreign intervention. Isn't this the main reason? Of course, we have all these shortcomings and aspirations, but wouldn't you say this is the main reason?
Well, I don't know what you mean by the big elephant. If you mean by foreign intervention, in the Shah book, there's certainly a great deal of discussion of the foreign role. It is not the way you like it, maybe. I don't know what your views are, but it's the way I see it. You might have a different view of how important the role of foreign intervention was. In the case of Aslan, it's a different story. I didn't say that he, first of all, I didn't mock him. And second of all, I said that he said, I can't leave my buddies alone. That's different than what, it wasn't manly, he said. That's very different than what John McCain said. And the John McCain story is completely different, and you should know this because you think you know the elephant in the room. John McCain was being released because he was the son of a senator. He said, I'm not going to be released because I'm a son of a senator. This is different than somebody who is a working class, and he could have said, I've got nothing here. And if I wanted to mock him, I wouldn't have picked him to write about him, of all the people that I was in prison for with a lot of people. And the notion that if we introduce complexity, we lose sight of the real story is an insult to everybody. It's an insult to literature. That's what literature does. Literature introduces complexity. It is dogmatists, it's ideologues, it is mullahs who simplify the story. The more you complicate the story, the more you show the complication. These people who sit in cafes here and there and say, the people who did this during the revolution are a bunch of lazy bastards. Read these people's lives. Find out who they were. Humanize them. And then ideological judgments become more difficult. So my goal was not to simplify the story. My goal was, in fact, to complicate the story. I think Nietzsche says it famously. He said, those who offer explanations are charlatans. Allow people to interpret themselves and allow them to recognize that the world is complicated. It has many, 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 many players. Each of the stories that we talk about, if you look at their individual complexity, I think you come away more hesitant to be judgmental. History teaches us, as literature does, to be less judgmental, to be more humble in understanding that our views are our views. Nothing more, nothing less.
If I can add my own view also, is that I don't understand why you or anyone would expect a book written by a professor of history to be only about to solve a historical question. I mean, it's just, it's it's a book of literature. It's like he said, and it just throws things out at you. Read them, see what you come up with, you know. So you cannot dictate, you cannot expect every book that has the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution as a theme, to be about the Islamic Revolution. It's about life. I mean, I think what this book is, it's about life. All these people who grew to be artists or intellectuals or political activists or, I don't know, prime ministers and what have you. Who are they? What are they thinking? Why did they do these things? And he pits and points to different aspects of their lives that make you, like you said, humanizes. It's the whole orchard. It's not just one flower or tree that he's looking at. And I don't think one should expect every book about the Iranian Revolution to be about the same thing. It's about life in that particular era.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I have two questions if I have time. One from you. As the translator, you are both invisible and at the same time deeply involved. So I wonder if you ever feel that you need to either clarify or contextualize or add some explanation about something in these stories for an English-speaking audience.
I did occasionally, and Dr. Milani agreed. Initially, he was a little bit hesitant, but that switched very, very quickly. He said to send him some samples of what. It really was mostly to identify people that not just foreigners, but Iranians of different generations, the Iranians who didn't know these other people, just anyone, without intruding in the style or the substance, really, just to embellish a little bit. And so, yes, we added a few names, a few descriptions of places, a few descriptions of, I mean, when I say descriptions, it's a few words just to embellish on, say, where or when or how this happened. And I think it helps in the English version. In the Persian, I had no trouble just reading the Persian as is written. But yes, in translating, you have to put yourself in the mind of the people who will be reading it in English and who might or might not know as much as the Persian readers do.
And one question, if I may ask Dr. Milani, in writing the book, how did you navigate the tension between honoring the complexities of the life of each of these individuals and a broader symbolic or metaphoric role that they played collectively in the history for Iran and in the history of Iran?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. I didn't ever write something because I had a design of the metaphor I wanted to make about the Iranian situation. So, as she said, embellish it in a way to create that metaphor. My hope was, and still is, I might have failed, I might not have succeeded, that if you put all of these together, these 60 portraits, you will come away with a better understanding of why Iran had this revolution, and you will also, I think, come to an understanding of why the future of Iran is great. There's and here there was conscious intervention in the way I put in the chapters together. There was because I wanted to end with a description of what the Iranian diaspora is, what Parvizi has done, what my brother has done, what Bita has done, what Hamid has done, and to say that there are people in diaspora who can help us, help Iran get out of this nightmare There's an image of a nightmare. I mean, Joyce talks about history as a nightmare from which we have to wake up. And this is, I think, if there is a metaphor in this book, and we have talked with her several times, it isn't like a nightmare, but it's a nightmare that has a lot of fascinating, interesting people. And in order to wake up from it, we need to understand it. We need to understand that we made these choices and are still making them. But I didn't embellish it to make that, because that becomes a very, I think, constructed. It's almost like writing sort of a conceptual. This is more an image-based. And one of the reasons we sort of back and forth a great deal about how much to add and how much to subtract was because my sense of these was that it is like a short story. It's a combination of a short story and a short essay. And if you give too much detail, then people come to me. I mean, there are many people who have been written about who come to me and say, well, how come you didn't write this? I said, well, this is a damn short story. It's not a profile of you. Or one person says, you know, on that meeting, I didn't have the sandal on. I had the sandal on the other time. Why did you make that mistake? I said, this is a short story, man. It's not. Some people suggested we put, a reviewer wrote of this and said, why don't you put pictures of these people? You'll get a better sense of them. I said, if I wanted to put pictures, it would be a wonderful but there would be a different narrative. And I don't know whether I made the right decision, but I think she's one more question. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for being here, both of you. Dr. Milani, I'm sure you've lived a very eventful life. There is no shortage of interesting people or influential people that you've met throughout your life. And I bet if you wanted to write about them, you could have maybe filled 10 more books. Mm-hmm. How did you go about choosing these people? I mean, some of them are clear, your mom, your sister, your uncle. I mean, these are the most influential people. I mean, you specifically. But what was the criteria? What was the approach you took?
There was no criteria. There was no criteria. It really was no criteria. I mean, I began writing it, and I wrote one and then another one. Sometimes I would, literally, some of these have been written in one day. And the next day I would feel like writing about somebody else. It is a work of the heart. I could be, you know, there are many other people that, one day I got up, I said, I have to write about Bahram Beyzai. And I wrote it. And it literally, and some people who are very, very dear to me, I've written a whole book about Golestan. There isn't a chapter on Golestan. Because it just wasn't.
But he's everywhere. You cite him, you quote him all along.
Yeah,
I want to read your book about Golestan someday.
Yeah, that really is. And I mean, that in a way goes to the point that he was making, which is, why should we care what your choices are? In a sense, the impolite way of what he said very politely, because he's always very polite in the questions.
I can be polite. No, I was.
No, I know you can be impolite. No, I've seen you being polite. You were being very polite to me. When you want to be impolite, I know you can be, and I was appreciating.
The key point for me, even with the explanations you offered, if I may, is really the book centers around Abbas Milani. It is Abbas Milani's selection of these personalities, and it is, for me, it would be a reason to read the book, because it's your personality and your scholarly work and your history, your life history, that puts this book into its.
So even when the times where you're very tough and impolite, which is very rare, and the time that you're polite, you're always making a good point. That's a wonderful thing about you. And the point you're making here is really remarkably accurate. Let me tell you why.
It's remarkably inaccurate.
Accurate. To be inaccurate doesn't need to be remarkable. People are inaccurate all the time, but to be remarkable. When I wrote my first memoir, which I wrote 40 years ago. It's called Tales of Two Cities. I initially wrote it as a series of essays on Iran's encounter with modernity. And I gave it to Stephen Greenblatt to read. I said, read this and give me an idea. What do you think about this? He read it. He said, don't fool yourself. This is not about modernity. This is your life. Write it as a memoir. Get it over with. So in a sense, this is a memoir. But it's a memoir that is written in the form of a puzzle. If there is a metaphor for this film, it's a puzzle in Citizen Kane. From those little puzzles, you can get something. It's a خاطرات خجالتی.